All right, per the bulletin, this sermon is titled, Offer Them Christ. Offer Them Christ. The basis is Matthew 18:15 through 20. Will you pray with me for a moment, please? Lord, for the sake of all living things, may my words not be trite. For the sake of all living things, may your word be heard. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. You, not me, me. Amen. My sermon outline doesn't deserve to see the light of day, which is why for maybe the first time ever, and I've been preaching since at least 1996, this is probably the first time ever I have come into a pulpit without a sermon outline, because my sermon outline does not deserve to see the light of day. That's how bad it is. I kind of knew that was coming at least by yesterday afternoon, about lunchtime, because I said to myself, this just isn't working. I was at a retreat for the reserves. I was over in Hampton. The facilitator for the retreat was Dr. Gerald Gray, and I think yesterday was the first time I've ever heard Dr. Gray say that he is a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I didn't know he was a bishop before. I knew he was a retired 06, a retired Navy chaplain captain, but I did not know until yesterday that he was a bishop. And so he said to me before I left yesterday, he said something about the sermon that I was going to give today. And I said, sir, I really think I'm just going to have to put my outline on the pulpit and just walk away from it and just say what I want to say, because it's not come out in my outline. And all he said to me was, preach strong. Preach strong. So I'm not sure how strong this will be. I just know for a fact my sermon outline this week did not deserve to see the light of day, which is why I didn't even bother printing it up. If you saw something I put on Facebook this week, you know that at one time, at least originally, the title for this sermon was not Offer Them Christ. The title for this sermon was How are you going to treat that tax collector? Now that almost never would have fit on the church sign outside, would it have? How are you going to treat that tax collector? Because to me, in part, this sermon all week has been about the pronouns. So how are you going to treat that tax collector? That bothered me a little bit. I thought, no, this doesn't need to be how are you going to treat? This needs to be more collective. So I was thinking it should be, how are we going to treat that tax collector? Now, what does Jesus say about tax collectors in this passage? He says if a brother or sister, as some translations say, here it says another member of the church sins against you and won't repent under any circumstances, then let that one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Now let me ask you this. How did Jesus treat tax collectors? How did Jesus treat tax collectors? Didn't he befriend them? Wasn't he said to be a friend of tax collectors? Wasn't Zacchaeus a tax collector? And what did he do? He said to Zacchaeus, I'm going to your house today. How did Jesus treat tax collectors when he tells us here to treat an unrepentant brother or sister like a tax collector? He also tells us to treat them, and again that's another pronoun, he also tells us to treat them as a Gentile. And how did Jesus treat the Gentiles? Now this is Matthew. Matthew was writing to Jewish Christians. There is a very strong Jewish influence in Matthew. And so for Jesus to say in Matthew, let that one be to you as a Gentile, is no surprise. But how did Jesus treat Gentiles? We're only a few chapters away from the story of the Canaanite woman. We preached on that one about a month ago. She was a Gentile. Jesus wouldn't go to her house. Jews didn't go to Gentile households. She had to come to him. She wanted her daughter healed. Did Jesus heal her daughter? Yes, he did. How did Jesus treat Gentiles? How did Jesus treat tax collectors? Think about it. We're almost getting close to the end of Matthew, and Jesus' last words are, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and all the world. So how does Jesus treat Gentiles along with tax collectors? And what does it mean here when he tells us to treat an unrepentant brother or sister, even in the church? What does that say to us here when he tells us to treat such a one as that as a Gentile or a tax collector? How do we process that? What do we think that means? That's a tough one to figure out. Why would he say that when we think about how the church is to treat Gentiles and tax collectors the way he did? It's kind of hard to think about, isn't it? There are so many ways of coming at this passage. There are so many ways of coming at this passage. I may have just preached on this passage here 3 years ago when I came up in the lectionary. It seems like the last time that I preached on it, I was thinking about the binding and loosing. Whatever we bound on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever we loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And that's about forgiveness right there. I mean, yes, this is a passage about forgiveness, something we're going to look at more next week when we finish the rest of the chapter. But Jesus is talking about forgiveness. He's talking about when a brother or sister sins against us, and he's talking about what we bind on earth, what we won't forgive on earth will not be forgiven in heaven either. And what we do forgive on earth, what we loose on earth, will be loosed in heaven as well. Jesus tells us this when he teaches us the Lord's Prayer, when he teaches us, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. When we pray, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. We are promising to forgive. Because we are forgiven, we promise to forgive. That means whatever we forgive, whatever we loose here is loosed in heaven. Whatever we bind here, whatever we don't let go here, whatever we don't forgive here, we take with us to heaven. And that stands in the way of our forgiveness, doesn't it? If we don't forgive the way we are forgiven, that stands in the way of our forgiveness. That's what Jesus means when he says whatever we bind here will be bound in heaven. Whatever we loose here will be loosed in heaven. That may have been the way I came at this passage the last time that I preached on it, but like I said initially, for me, this week, this was all about the pronouns. This was all about the pronouns because Jesus says here at the very end, wherever two of you or more are gathered in my name, I am there in the midst of you. Wherever two or more of you are gathered in my name, I am there in the midst of you. Think about those pronouns and think about what that means. Whenever two or more of us gather in Jesus' name, he is here with us. Pronouns all over the place. He is here with us whenever two or more of us gather in his name. Do we think about that? As a church, do we think about that? Do we think about the fact that anytime two or more of us gather in his name, he is there with us? Think about that. Whenever two or more gather in his name, he is there with us. Whenever two or more of us get together in this church, do we acknowledge, do we honor the presence of Christ with us? When we meet, when we worship, when we study, when we fellowship here in this church on Sunday morning, during the week, in Sunday school, at Coffee on the Porch, at Paul's and Faith, wherever two or more of us gather in his name, do we ever think to honor the presence of Christ with us? Because when we gather, he is with us. And do we always, or do we ever, acknowledge and honor his presence with us? And what does it mean if we do that? What does it mean if we do that? If when we get together at night for a weeknight for a meeting, or on Sunday morning for Sunday school, for worship, for coffee on the porch, on the Sunday afternoon, the first day of the month, for Paul's and Faith, whenever we get together, are we honoring and are we aware of the presence of Jesus Christ? Because if that's so, then what happens? If that's so, then what happens? What happens when we get together and know that the presence of Christ is there with us? What happens when we get together? How do we treat one another? What do we do at those times when we gather and know he is with us? What do we do that shows that we honor his presence? Do we do anything that shows that we honor his presence? I really wanted to stress it this morning when the light of Christ was carried into the sanctuary. That's something we say, and I don't want it to be perfunctory. When we talk about the light of Christ being carried into the sanctuary, I want us to think about acknowledging the presence of Christ. And whenever 2 or 3 of us gather in his name, no matter what time of the week it is, no matter whether it's for meeting, worship, study, Sunday school, what have you, I want us to think about, to acknowledge, and to honor the presence of Christ. And as we do that, as we gather in his name, not only do I want us to honor his presence, I want us to offer one another Christ. I want us to offer one another Christ whenever we gather. Whenever we gather. And that's where the sermon title comes from. Offer them Christ, according to the bulletin, is the sermon title. It's not exactly original. I think the painting is on the 3rd floor here outside Karen Ward's Sunday school class. I think it's the painting up there, and I might be mistaken, that has John Wesley with the priests. He has just ordained in the Church of England, allegedly just ordained them, to send them to America. What the caption on the picture says is, offer them Christ. Allegedly, that's what John Wesley said to the priests that he ordained, not that he had that power in the Church of England, something the Church of England didn't like very much, that he would do this. Not that he had that power, but he ordained priests to go to the New World. And as the history lesson goes, as he did that, he told them, offer them Christ. As you go to the New World, offer them Christ. Yet another pronoun. I said it was all about the pronouns this week. When John Wesley sent new priests to the New World, he said to them, offer them Christ. So when we meet, when 2 or more of us gather in his name, I want us to honor his presence, but I also want us to offer one another Christ. Offer Christ. That's what the church sign says outside. It doesn't say offer them Christ. I took the pronoun out because I kept making it shorter. From how are we going to treat that tax collector down to offer Christ. I kept making it shorter, and that's okay. Shorter is good. My prior career was editing. I like shorter, so we're all the way down now to offer Christ. Can we do that as a church? Can we do that? Can we offer Christ? Let me ask you something, because I know the church has a mission statement. I don't much care for it because it says we are, and I don't think that are is a proper verb for a mission statement. We can probably change that. Probably need to. Let me ask you this. Does this church have a vision statement? Does this church have a vision statement? I'm going into my 4th year of ministry at this church. And if this church has a vision statement, it's new to me. Do we have a vision statement? Not a mission statement. I know we've got one. Do we have a vision statement? If not, can we adopt that one? Offer Christ. Can that be our mission statement? Offer Christ. Whenever 2 or more of us gather in his name, may we not only acknowledge him and honor his presence, may we offer one another Christ. And I'm not sure if another is a pronoun or not, but whenever we gather, may we offer one another Christ. Think about how that might change things in meetings, in Sunday school, in worship, whatever we're doing, and wherever and whenever we're doing it. Think about how it might change if we offer one another Christ. Maybe that can be our vision. Maybe that can be our vision, and it's not just when we gather, whenever we're on the street, whenever we're talking to someone who knows we are a Christian, may we offer Christ.